Before we really get into the history proper of the Jewish-Roman War, I do want to go over some of these individuals. I don't want to talk about all their history because we'll get into that. But Ananias, I think, would be important to talk about. Just like the Herods, he's a very confusing figure in biblical history. We talked about the Herods, and you hear Herods did such and such. Well, you got to know which Herod, don't you? Was it Archelaus? Was it Agrippa? Was it the Great? Unfortunately, it's the same problem with Ananias. And Ananias is called by 3 different names in Jewish history. Sometimes you'll hear him referred to as Annas. Everybody knows the name Annas from the Bible? Remember Annas and Caiaphas involved in the trial of Jesus? That was the first prominent one of this family, the patriarch, if you will. Sometimes he's called Annas, A-N-N-A-S. Sometimes he's called Ananias, and sometimes he's called Ananus, A-N-A-N-U-S. I'm going to try to refer to him as Ananias. He was placed in his position as a high priest. This isn't the way you want it done. By the Romans. He was high priest in Jerusalem when Jesus was a little boy. So at the time that Jesus would have gone up to the temple, Ananias, or Annas, would have been the high priest. At the time that Jesus was brought in judgment, that same Annas was there with Caiaphas. Caiaphas, by the way, was Annas' son-in-law. Caiaphas married Annas' daughter. Annas was an interesting figure because he was actually taken out of his position by the Romans. He was very influential, and so they took him out of his position. But Annas had 5 sons who all were in the priesthood at one point in time, and they all sometimes used a name that's similar to his. So sometimes you'll hear Annas or Ananias referred to, and it's not talking about him, it's talking about one of his sons. There was Ananias the elder, and there was his son, Ananias, if you like this, or Ananus, the son of Ananus. That doesn't help matters any, does it? Ananias, the son of Ananias. He was killed during part of this Jewish-Roman War, and his dad was killed during part of the Jewish-Roman War. Josephus is the historian who we get all this information from, and it's hard to tell in Josephus' writing sometimes which one he's talking about. I'm not going to go over the rest of these because we'll meet them during the story. So our part 1 here is going to be from 66 to 69 AD. Since we're not going to be talking about the church a great deal tonight, we're going to be talking about what happened in Jerusalem. I'll give you at least the background of what was going on with the church right before this. Most of the leaders of the early church, the apostles and the leaders of the early church, died by the time the Jewish-Roman War was over. That is very significant to understand in why the church went the direction it did and why some of the things happened. James, a brother of Jesus, was martyred in 62 AD according to tradition. That isn't in the Bible. James, the brother of John, is recorded in the book of Acts, his death. But James, the brother of Jesus, and guess who instigated his martyrdom? Ananias. Around 64 AD that Rome burned. The belief was that Nero was behind it. He was the emperor at the time. He was not in his right mind, and he had this idea that he wanted to rebuild parts of the city, so some of them thought he probably burned it down on purpose. But he didn't just evacuate the city and burn people's houses. Whoever burned it set the city on fire with the people in it. So it was a very tumultuous situation, and Nero, of course, people started hinting at the fact they thought he was responsible, so he put the blame on the Christians in Rome. This unusual group of religious zealots that are in Rome called Christians, it's their fault. And that began probably the first true Gentile persecution of the church. The Jews had been persecuting it, and I'm sure that evangelists who went to other countries were persecuted, but the first truly imperial persecution happened under Nero, where Christians were tortured. He put them out in his gardens and lit them on fire to light his gardens. Very gruesome situation. It's during that period of time from 64 somewhere up to around 67 that most historians would say Paul and Peter were killed, somewhere during 64 and 67. And both of them were believed to have been martyred by order of Nero. So the majority of the apostolic leaders of the church, many of them were already dead at the time the Jewish-Roman War started or right after it started. James around 62 AD, Matthias, who was of course the replacement for Judas, is believed to have been killed in 64. Peter around 64 to 67, and Paul 64 to 67. John Mark was believed to have been killed around 68. Now remember, the Jewish-Roman War lasted from 66 to 73. Bartholomew is believed to have died around 68, Andrew around 69, Thomas around 69, Luke around 69, Jude around 72, Barnabas 73, Simon Zelotes around 74. That gives you an idea that the vast majority of the leadership of the church were gone by the time of the end of the Jewish-Roman War. Do you think that's significant? You've got now the Jewish Christians who were in Jerusalem, where the center of the Christian movement started, scattered all over the countryside. We'll talk about why that was in a few minutes. You've got their leaders martyred off by near the end of the war, other than just a couple of them. Do you think it'd be easy for the church to move forward in its integrity when almost all of its leaders are gone and it's scattered? And if you think about the fact that James was killed around 62 and Peter was killed around 64 to 67, do you realize that before the fall of Jerusalem, 2 of the 3 people that Paul referred to as the pillars of the church were already dead? That should give you some insight into how critical this time was for the church. All right, let's talk about Israel, because that's really what this is going to be related to. There's several things that were going on in the nation of Israel politically and economically that led up to the reasons for this war. Who knows what the Pax Romana is?
The Roman peace.
Yes, the peace of Rome, or the Roman peace. Who knows how Rome kept peace? They were just such nice guys, everybody wanted to be peaceful with them? No. The Roman peace was kept by force. There was a great deal of peace in the empire, but most of it was due to the fact that people were scared out of their wits of the legions being sent in to quell any rebellion. The Jews, because of their intensity and because of their religious fervor, tended not to fall into that category. If they got mad enough, they didn't care how many legions you sent in, and that's really what led to this war, is they were instigated and instigated and instigated until finally war broke out, a war that had been bubbling under the surface for a long time. Israel, as a province, was a tributary state to Rome. Do you know what a tributary state is? They were tributary states several times in their history. They were a tributary state to Babylon at one time. A tributary state is somebody that sends tribute. They send money, they send taxes back to a home country. Do you think they appreciated that? Well, no, they didn't appreciate that. How'd you like it if you had to not only pay taxes to your local government, your state government, the United States of America, but say that China said, now from now on you got to send taxes to us? Nobody would be too happy about that, I imagine. And Israel chafed under the yoke of Rome, partly because of some of the economic issues, but partly because they had a terrible burning desire to be politically independent. Part of this was religiously motivated. The Zealots, for example, were on fire about this particular issue. This was their political plank, if you will. Nobody but God deserved you to pay tribute to him. So thus, since nobody but God deserved your tribute, we need to overthrow Rome because they're requiring tribute of us. But they had no problem. In fact, most of the Jews are this way, had no problem with paying a tax to the temple. There was a temple tax that they paid to the temple, to the church, so to speak. They felt that was religiously applicable. But to pay a tax to a foreign power, other than God, stirred the hearts of some of the zealots. So that was something that was going on underneath the surface. And the tax burden of having to pay taxes to all these local and imperial level tax collectors, you can see why Matthew was such a hated individual. The tax burden crippled quite a few people. What we would call in our day bankrupted. They didn't have the option of bankruptcy in that day. They did have under the Jews the year of Jubilee, but I highly doubt if you went into debt to a Roman, they'd let the year of Jubilee be your excuse to get out of it. So they were crippled by this debt. A lot of people lost their lands, they lost their farms, they had no way to get them back. It was a very dire situation for them from an economic standpoint. And the other problem that created is that it created this undercurrent of individuals who were destitute in society, who'd lost everything, and in the midst of that undercurrent, a criminal class started to develop. You know, that happens pretty often. You get people that don't know how they're going to support themselves, don't know how they're going to feed their families and so on, and they turn to a life of crime and banditry. And there were bandits roaming the countryside during that time, Jewish bandits, because they'd been put out of work, they'd lost their money. So banditry started to rise, so that caused a little bit of tension. Then there was something else that happened around 63 AD, and I'll see if you can figure out what it was. It was a construction project, a major construction project in Israel that had been started in 19 BC. If you have 19 BC and 63 BC, you're looking at 82 years at least. A project that took 82 years to complete. Anybody have a hazard a guess at what it was? Herod's Temple. Herod's Temple was begun in 19 BC. Amazingly enough, it wasn't really completed until 63 BC. They were using it, but it wasn't considered completed until 63. Now that sounds like it'd be a time of joy. The temple is finally completed, but let me explain to you why that wouldn't be a time of joy. First of all, Herod was savvy enough to know when he began building the temple that there's elements of the temple that the common individuals outside the priesthood should not be involved in touching or building. Once you start building the construction area, for example, of the holy place and the Holy of Holies, nobody should really be involved in that but priests. So Herod hired 1,000 at one time, Levitical priests, to be carpenters to work on the temple. And all through the time the temple was being built, there were thousands and thousands of individuals that had a job, as long as the temple was being built. But what happens to construction workers when there's nothing left to build? They get laid off, right? So the temple came to its conclusion in 63 BC, and now thousands of men who had, at least for that generation, been able to work on this project now had nothing to do. That added a tremendous strain. Some of them, I'm sure, found other jobs, but when you're talking about that many people getting laid off at one time and such a huge building project, caused a tremendous amount of pressure. All through this time, probably because of Rome, probably because of reading in Daniel and some of the prophets, and then the fact that they run to Rome, the fact that they felt like there had to be a revolt, there was this undercurrent going on as well of an apocalyptic spirit. Do you know what that is? That means they were looking for an apocalypse. They were looking for God to come directly and intervene in this, destroy the Romans, send the Messiah. Funny that they were looking for that right when it happened and they didn't get it, but they were looking for that. There was a real apocalyptic belief system going on in Israel at that time. And then there was a lot of resistance against Rome, played out in a lot of unusual ways. There was a type of dinnerware made from a certain kind of pottery, and it was called red slip. Like we would say Corel or something like that. It's a certain type of clay that's made to make the pottery in a certain way. It's fired in a certain way that it looks when it's done. Everybody had red slip dinnerware. You had to have red slip dinnerware. It was imported through Rome, so Rome obviously got a markup on it and made some money by selling this red slip dinnerware into these provinces. People would make a political statement, and you could tell if you went to eat dinner at someone's house if they were for or against Rome. If somebody was anti-Roman, they wouldn't buy red slip dinnerware, and it would not be found in their house. It was the ladies of the house made their statement. I'm not for the Romans, so there won't be any red slip dinnerware in this house. Go to someone else's house, you might be looking down the nose at them if they got their red slip dinnerware, since that was, again, the height of fashion. But of course, it was a way that they could make a statement without doing anything aggressive, that we're not in support of Rome. The other element that was going on in Israel, you see a little hint of this in the New Testament records, were the Zealots. We talked about them before. They were a group who was determined to overthrow Rome, one way or another. The Zealots had subgroups within them. As extreme as some of the Zealots were, there were more extreme cells within the Zealots that were even worse than just the regular Zealots. The Sicarii literally means dagger men. They were the worst of the bunch. They were the ones who would roam through the crowds at feast days and look for anybody that they thought was pro-Roman, or look for even Roman officials. And they'd crowd in around them in a crowd, and while they were crowded in, say with 8 or 10 of the Sicarii, they'd go to knifing the individual with a crowd around them so no one could see, and then they just all disperse into the crowd, and here's somebody laying there bleeding all over the street. They were very brutal. They came into play because they were one of the groups that ended up in Jerusalem when the Romans surrounded Jerusalem, and they kept the fire burning, as far as kept a lot of violence going within the walls during that time, and they had a lot of infighting between the different sects of the Zealots. Precursors to war. Israel was under this Roman domination almost all the way back to 63 BC when Pompey came into Israel. You had this Herodian dynasty that was in power. They had parts and portions of Israel they'd ruled during different periods, as we talked about earlier. But the Herodian dynasty was still in power. One of the Herod Agrippas was in power during this time. They just weren't the final word. The final word was the Romans. But it was controversial because most conservative Jews didn't want Herod there at all. They didn't agree with any of Herod or his progeny having any degree of authority over them. Then you had these local and imperial tax burdens I talked about. You had the temple being completed. And then this one last element that we're going to talk about in a little more detail, you had some extremely corrupt and abusive local Roman overseers. The governors, the procurators. They did not send prominent governors. Let's give you an example of this. Say you had somebody in your political party that was a real powerhouse. They were somebody that was very good at their job, a very good politician, very skilled. That isn't the kind of politician they would send to rule over Israel. They'd send the low men on the totem pole. They'd send people that didn't have much political skill, and it wasn't considered a good post. So it was the low men on the totem pole that were sent to Israel. Now here's the problem with that. Some of those people did not have enough political savvy to know how to handle the Jews. Some of them were probably irritated by their post, and they took it out on the Jews, and it caused more and more problems. Israel was under, in an imperial sense, under the covering of the Roman legate in Antioch in Syria. The main post where the overseer was at was in Antioch in Syria. And then in Caesarea, in Israel is where the procurator, someone like Pilate, would be at. Gessius Florus, the procurator at this particular period in time from 64 to 66 AD. Florus was probably more than any other element the reason that this war started. Seems almost as if he wanted the war to happen. He began to be procurator around 64. The reason he was made procurator was because Nero, who still was emperor during this time, his wife Poppaea, was good friends with Florus's wife. He favored the Gentiles highly over the Jews. And in the summer of 66 AD, he did something that caused a tremendous blow-up. He demanded that the overseers of the temple give him 17 talents of gold out of the temple treasury. Some historians believe he even tried to take some of the actual temple treasures, some of the holy things. As you can imagine, this caused a tremendous amount of unrest in Jerusalem. A lot of people were ready to riot. During this same period of time, over in Caesarea, where his seat was at to the northwest, there was a tremendous amount of racial and civil turmoil going on between the Greek Gentiles of that city and the Jews. And at one point, after Florus had been showing a lot of favoritism to the Gentiles, I guess they felt like they could get away with this. Just to irritate the Jews, one of the Gentile individuals went out in front of one of their synagogues, got a big bowl, turned it upside down right in front of the door, took a bird and sacrificed a bird in front of the door of the synagogue, knowing that that would make the entryway unclean so they couldn't be able to go in the synagogue. The Jews went to Florus and asked him to intervene. They even paid him to intervene. And he later just laughed at them and told them, "I'll take your money, that's fine, but I'm not helping you with nothing." And there were multiple things like that he did. He just stirred up a lot of trouble. That isn't the worst of what he did that caused the problems, though. This really began the worst of it when he asked for these 17 talents. The response to that by the Jewish population wasn't just the fact that people got irritated behind closed doors. Some of them thought they would make fun of him. So they had people going around the streets with an offering bowl. Now, you don't really do this to a Roman politician. At least one individual roaming the streets with an offering bowl making this call. "We need offerings for poor Florus. He doesn't have enough money. He's trying to take the money from the temple." And he did say that the money from the temple was for government expenses, He doesn't have enough money to support himself, so can we get some offerings for Florus? That probably irritated him worse than any of the other things that were going on. The fact they were mocking him and walking around the city taking up an offering for him. So he made probably the decision that initially really started this war. He sent Roman soldiers into the city of Jerusalem and told them they were allowed to raid the market of the city. And they raided the upper market, murdered Jews, stole things, assaulted individuals, caused a tremendous ruckus. He told them to arrest anybody that they even thought could be involved in mocking him or complaining about what he'd been doing. And they arrested quite a few people. They flogged and scourged some of them. I'll let you find out what flogging and scourging consists of. It's a lot worse than just being whipped with a whip. Some of those individuals that were flogged and scourged were the temple priests that they thought were involved in this. That caused quite a bit of antagonism. 3,600 Jews were killed during that particular point in time in that slaughter. If that wasn't insult to injury, the man's demanded money from the temple, the man has sided with other racial groups within the borders of Israel and embarrassed and humiliated the Israelites. He's sent Roman troops into Jerusalem and allowed them to just basically rob and pillage and kill 3,600 individuals. If that wasn't enough, he gathered together the leaders of the city, including the temple priests, and he told them, "Here's what I want you to do. I think there's still a bad attitude." I'm going to put it in modern words. He didn't say these words. "I think you really still have a bad attitude, and I think the people of this city still have a really bad attitude towards Rome and towards my oversight. So I want you to prove that you have respect for me and for the Roman army. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send 2 cohorts of Roman soldiers down to the city. And when they get here, I want people to be out there to greet them. Like we think of somebody welcoming home a conquering army, shouting and waving at them and so on. I want everybody to be out there to greet them, to show them how much they love the Roman, after they'd killed 3,600 of them, to show them how much they love them." It took a tremendous amount of effort and political savvy for the priests and the aristocrats of the city to convince the people to do this, but they did. The people went out, and as the Roman cohorts were coming up, little did they know that Florus had told the commander, "If they're waving at you, if they're friendly to you, I want you to be just as gruff and as mean as you can be. Don't even look at them. Don't wave back to them. Don't even act like you see them." Now, why would he do that? Well, clearly he wanted to start some trouble. It's interspersed all through the crowd of ones who went out with the purpose of trying to show respect to the Roman troops to keep the peace. The priests, Sadducees in particular were famous for this. Their goal was always to try to keep the peace with Rome. We've talked about it before. Why do you think the Sadducees would be so important with keeping the peace with Rome? Well, there's two big reasons. They were part of the aristocratic class. You don't want to lose everything, do you? They take away your house and your money. You don't want to lose your position as a priest either. If they're letting you be a priest, let's make peace with them. Here's the problem with people that like to stay in the middle like that, in the neutral ground. They usually end up dying first. And after this Jewish-Roman war, there really were no Sadducees left. The Jews that you see today, as far as the religious element of the Jews today, is descended from the Pharisees, not the Sadducees. The Sadducees had nothing left after this. When the temple was destroyed and most of them had died, there wasn't really a Sadducee sect left. So rabbinical Judaism that you see today traces its lineage back to the Pharisees, not the Sadducees. So here's what Florus did. He told the commander to be just as rough and gruff with them as you can. Don't wave back to him. Don't be friendly to him. So, of course, interspersed through the crowd were zealots and other individuals that were not wanting to show any respect to the Roman legions to begin with. They were just looking for an excuse. So when the Roman legions came through there acting rude, the zealots started to shout out nasty things about Florus and Rome and everything else. And a mob scene started. It became so bad, the Romans could not get through into Jerusalem to get to Antonia, the fortress, which is where they were headed. They were driven back, and a stampede started, and thousands more Jews were killed. So again, Florus adds insult to injury by creating some of these problems. Here's where we find our first Eleazar. This is Eleazar ben Ananias. He was the commander of the temple guard. Eleazar convinced the priests to stop offering sacrifices for any Gentiles. Now here's what that meant. For quite a long time, for probably almost 100 years at this point, the Jewish priests had been offering sacrifices for the empire. So when they had their morning and evening sacrifices, the daily sacrifices, they would have a special sacrifice. Now the emperor didn't come. He didn't offer his own sacrifice. But they'd have a special sacrifice for the emperor at Rome and for the empire. And that went on for probably in the neighborhood of 100 years. As soon as they stopped offering sacrifices for Gentiles, which means anybody that's a Roman, including the emperor, it was a statement of a declaration of war. Because that was the agreement on which their religious independence hinged, was whether or not they continued offering those sacrifices. It was a concession and a trade-off that the Romans allowed the Jews so that they didn't have to carry out the rituals of emperor worship. Some of the moderates, including Ananias, tried their best to get this sacrificial system back into place for the Gentiles, but the extremists wouldn't do it. They even got down to the point where they were fighting in the streets over that issue of whether or not they were going to allow them to sacrifice the Gentiles. And during this time, Ananias got his house burnt down. They said, you want to sacrifice to some Gentiles? Well, we'll burn your house down. So they burned old Ananias' house down. Now, I want to tell you about some of these strange signs that were going on and some of the events that occurred during this period. This isn't chronological necessarily, it's just some of the strange events that were going on right around the time of the Jewish-Roman War that seemed like they may have been prophetic. The Jews certainly took them this way. Josephus, in his book on the Jewish War, records several of these. During the Feast of Unleavened Bread in 66 AD, at 3 o'clock a.m., in the middle of the night, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, a light as bright as daylight appeared around the altar over the temple for half an hour. Now, some of the people thought this is a wonderful thing. What a sign. It's a sign that this feeling we're getting to rebel against Rome must be right, because the Lord has had a light come over his holy place. But most of the intelligentsia, most of the scribes and the priesthood believed that it was a precursor of some terrible event that was coming. Then there were several other things that happened during the feast that were strange. There was a heifer that was being led up for sacrifice, and they said that right in the middle of the time they were getting ready to sacrifice it, that heifer gave birth to a lamb. So that seemed to be a strange sign to them. Again, the common people thought, well, this is a sign that we're supposed to turn against Rome, all these strange spiritual things. The elite, the intelligentsia, the aristocrats felt like that God's trying to tell them something. If any of these things were true, God probably was trying to tell them something. The judgment was about to fall on them. Around midnight during the feast, the huge eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which by the way was made of brass, so imagine how heavy it'd be, normally took 20 men to shut this gate. Midnight, it just swung open all on its own. That was one of the examples that the rabbis looked at and said, God is getting ready to leave this place. That's why he's opening these doors to show us he's leaving, and we're on dangerous ground. On the 21st day of the month of Iyar, just before sunset, people saw what they thought were chariots and soldiers in armor in the clouds above the city of Jerusalem. Now, I'm not claiming any of these things really happened, but it is unusual that these people were seeing all kinds of strange supernatural events right before all this was going to break out. Right during the night portion of the Feast of Pentecost in 66 AD, as the priests were entering the inner court of the temple, and if this really happened, this would be incredible. They felt the earth shake as they were getting ready to go into the temple, and they said that they heard a sound like a multitude of voices saying this phrase, "Let us remove hence." Now, to put that in modern terms, let us leave this place. Now, if that really happened, it'd be a tremendous statement that God was saying that he is leaving that place in its entirety. Now, of course, from a Christian standpoint, you'd want to look all the way back to the time of Jesus' crucifixion, when the veil of the temple was rent from the top all the way down to the bottom. That is certainly a statement of God making a change, whether you see it from either perspective, that God was making a statement that he was leaving that place, or that he was making a statement that, at least in a spiritual sense, now the way's open of access to God. You can see it from both directions. I've always taught it that way, that physically and literally God was leaving the holiest there. But from a spiritual standpoint, the holiest in heaven was being opened so that men could have access to it. That's not the end of the story about this voice and this light. The Jewish historians state that the Shekinah glory departed the temple at that time and remained over the Mount of Olives for 3.5 years. And they said the people going up on the Mount of Olives sometime could hear a voice coming from the mount pleading for the Jews to repent. And it's said that right before the Roman siege of Jerusalem, which was in 70 AD, that the light and the presence and the voice ceased off the mountain. Now, all that could be fables. But just to give you an idea of what kind of an atmosphere was going on in that city, there was a lot of things going on. And even if none of that was true, can you imagine what was being talked about in the streets? Did you see those men in the clouds the other night? Did you see the light leave the temple? Can you imagine the spirit it would create in Jerusalem and how that tension would be rising? NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory publishes the times that Halley's Comet passes. March of the year of 66 AD, Halley's Comet had its closest approach, right when all this was going on. A lot of unusual things going on.
You went back to the time of Christ when crucifixion, when the veil was rent. Those stories remind me of some other ones I think that you mentioned. Did the candle keep going out?
Yes.
And they couldn't do anything to keep it lit?
During that period. And one of those stories is very similar, and it could even be the same story, where it said the inner court's door came open.
Yeah, it kept open.
That was one of the signs the Jews were seeing the 40 years prior to the destruction. That's what they say, the 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple. Let's use some math. Temple was destroyed in 70 AD, so when would that have probably started? The strange signs they say were going on for 40 years. 30. Now remember, our calendar's off 3 or 4 or 5 years. That was right around the time Jesus was crucified and rose from the grave. What an unusual time for God to show that his presence was leaving Israel. Now, if all those things are true, I don't lay claim that those strange events were true. But the other ones you're talking about, Rodney, one of them was that inner door would open by itself. Sounds like the same event they're describing here. One of them was that when they would take the lot for the scapegoat, that it would always come up in the left hand.
Did that for like years and years in a row or something?
Yeah, and there were a lot of those little and strange things that they said something is wrong. Something is really wrong. God is doing something. And some of the most significant rabbis saw that just like they did here. Not as a good sign that God's getting ready to bless us or defeat our enemies, but as a very bad sign. The doors in the temple are opening. The other example, Rodney, was the fact that they would light the 7 golden candlesticks, which are intended to burn through the night. And no matter how much oil they put in them, they'd be burned out when they came in the morning. It very well could be, saints, that God was making a statement to them, I am leaving this place. If you want to be specific, God left it when they crucified his son. He was no longer accepting sacrifices at the moment that Jesus' blood was shed on that cross. Any sacrifice from the moment of Jesus' death was not only inappropriate, but an abomination. It looks like God was still trying to reach anybody that he could to get them to come out of that situation. And that period lasted right around 40 years, right around from the time of Jesus. I've used these scriptures where he says, this generation shall not pass. Now there's several ways you can take those scriptures, and they're very difficult to place in time. But I'll tell you one thing, that generation did not pass. No matter how you take that scripture, whether you mean the generation that's going to be alive in the future, that could be one way of taking it. There'll be a generation alive in the future that'll see those things. But there was also a Jewish generation in that day that saw some of the very things Jesus prophesied about, and we're going to get into those in just a minute. We're going to talk about how this war started, then we're going to talk about some of the reasons the Christians left the city. But you had the lamps in the temple go out, you had the door opening, You had the lot turning up in the left hand, and all those things to the rabbis represented not a blessing or God's trying to get our attention to tell us something good, but rather that there's terrible calamity coming on us. And they were right. And I've always thought it's so heartbreaking that they were not able to track it back and say, what did we do that would cause God to want to bring this terrible wrath on us? Blindness in part happened to Israel. They were literally blind to what they had done. They did the very thing that caused this wrath, and even today, most of them cannot see that what they did has caused the problems that they've faced through history. But let's talk about how this Jewish rebellion began. This would definitely get some people on your side. In our day and age, debt is kept track of in so many ways, there's no way you could erase it. And you couldn't get rid of your debt by burning the mortgage note. Everything is so computerized and it's in databases and everybody's got records of it, including the big credit reporting agencies. In that day, it was a little bit different. If you owed some money on your farm because you borrowed some money from somebody, they kept a paper record of it. There was no other way to do it. They didn't have computers. And they had to keep that paper record somewhere secure. So they had archives in Jerusalem. Some people believe it was in the Antonia fortress. The very first thing the Jewish rebels did when they finally decided we've had it is they broke into the archives and burned all the debt notes. Now, I want you to think about how exciting that would have been for a whole lot of people. You don't know how you're going to make a payment on the farm, and you're about to lose it. And then somebody tells you they burned all the debt notes. There's no way to prove they even had a debt. That got a lot of the common people on their side. A whole lot of the common citizens of Jerusalem joined the fracas and decided they wanted to be a part of this rebellion. In this same time period, the rebels captured the Antonia fortress, and they killed the Roman garrison there. I put some pictures up here, and you can see them on your map of Jerusalem. The Antonia fortress was very, very critical to anything related to the temple. This is the courtyard around the temple, what Herod built. It has nothing to do with the temple proper. It's this huge courtyard that he built, and he built the temple inside that big agora. One of the walls of this courtyard on the lower part is what I mentioned earlier, is the Jewish Western Wailing Wall. It is not a wall of the temple. Sometimes that's given that idea in people's mind. It's part of this retaining wall that held all that together where the temple was built. Here's this fortress overseeing the temple. I'm sure they didn't want, if they're going to have a rebellion, any chance of any of their enemies being in a fortress that looks right down into the temple. So that was one of the first things they did, is the rebels took hold of the fortress of Antonia. Right around this same time, Zechariah took Masada. Masada was one of the very first fortresses taken in Israel, and Masada was the last fortress to be retaken by the Romans. So Zechariah took Masada in 66 AD in August when the war really started, and it wasn't until 73 to 74 when Masada finally fell that it was finally lost. The Jews attacked Herod's palace. They attacked the camp of Florus's cohorts. They massacred the Roman forces, and that after they had agreed to let them surrender. They basically had agreed that the Romans could surrender in exchange for safe passage, and after they agreed to that, the Romans put their weapons down and they massacred all the Romans. The Gentile citizens of Caesarea, in response to hearing that the Jews had massacred these Roman forces and had seized Antonia and some of this, decided to massacre all the Jews in the city of Caesarea. In 1 hour's time, 20,000 or more Jews were killed, and it emptied Caesarea of all their Jewish inhabitants. Any of the Jews that could escape and ran out, Florus captured and put on slave galleys to serve the empire. September. Didn't take long before the legate who oversaw this, Florus certainly wasn't capable of defending himself against all these rebels. So his overseer, who was in Antioch of Syria, Cestius Gallus, entered into Israel with 4 legions. That's a lot of troops. A legion can vary, but that's at least 20 to 24,000 Roman soldiers and other local troops. And he had a total group with some of the local troops he brought down from Syria, about 30,000 men he entered Israel with. He came down the coast from Antioch. Antioch is all the way up the west coast from Israel. It's in Syria. He came down the coast, started seizing cities in the western and northern part of the country. And then after he had seized several of the cities, he made a loop back around to Jerusalem, and some very unusual events happened when he got to Jerusalem. Anytime anyone would get up to Jerusalem, they'd always come to Mount Scopus, which was about a mile or so north of Jerusalem. It was a high point. For some inexplicable reason that nobody knows, he withdrew and started to retreat back to the coast. On his way back to the coast at Beth Horon, he was ambushed by some of the zealot rebels, and unbelievable considering how disciplined the Roman legions were. They were in a very tight formation. For some reason, they got so scared by this rebel ambush that they broke formation and started to run. And when they started to retreat, it became such a massacre that it became a rout. There's a vast difference between a retreat and a rout. A retreat is when you're, and I'm getting out of here. A rout is running for your life. The Jews murdered quite a number of. Not only that, they were in such a hurry to get away, they left most of their military supplies behind, which was a real benefit to those Jewish troops. They were able to take those back to Jerusalem. The history of the Jewish-Roman War is very difficult because Josephus is really the only one who told all of it. And some of his history is questionable because, as you'll see when I talk about Josephus, he's questionable. Just like previously when the citizens of Caesarea started murdering Jews, the citizens of Damascus in Syria thought, this is our excuse to murder some Jews. They killed 10,000 unarmed Jews in the city. Fall of 66 AD. Here's one of our characters you're going to see a little bit later, Simon Bar Giora. Now, just for your own sake, you that are in the Hebrew class, you notice that when somebody's the son of somebody, it's Eliezer ben such and such. You will see quite often this word bar used. Ben is the Hebrew. Bar is the Aramaic. Around this time in the fall of 66 AD, he started to rise up as a bandit and a guerrilla fighter in the countryside. There were a lot of these. In Jerusalem during this time, the Zealots took control of the temple compound and used it as their fortress, their staging area. This is going to start to divide up how Jerusalem would be when the siege happens. Now, Simon ben Giora did so many criminal acts out in the countryside that Ananias, the priest back in Jerusalem, put a price on his head, put a warrant out for his arrest, essentially. And eventually, Simon ben Giora made his way to Masada and hid out there for a while, until after Ananias died. From the winter of 66 to 67, the Jewish rebels divided up the land into 7 districts. Each of these districts was overseen by a rebel commander. They were trying to establish their own government. They really hadn't taken control of the entire land, but they were having such success at this point, they figured we'll set up 7 leaders. Josephus was the governor in Galilee. He was the one who was the commander of the rebel forces in the Galilee. And here's how the districts were broken up. Galilee and Jericho, northeast Judea, Jerusalem, western Judea, Idumea, and Petrea.
Is this Josephus?
That's exactly right. He wrote the Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote the Jewish-Roman War. Most people know the name Josephus because Christians do quote him quite a bit as an historian of the Jewish first century especially. Most people don't know the drama behind Josephus, some of the things that he did and how he was viewed. But I want to take a pause here and go into some scriptures. Somewhere in this period, somewhere in 66, 67, 68, somewhere right in there, the Christians begin to make a mass exodus out of the area. Some people deny this happened. Some people say that they probably died there in Jerusalem, but there's plenty of evidence to show the Christians got out of Jerusalem. What would have caused them to do that? Well, one tradition is that the leaders of the Christian church in Jerusalem had a vision, and the Lord told them to leave Jerusalem, which would have been wise because Jerusalem was going to go through a bloodbath. Another thing that you could add to that, or even say would be another reason, would be the fact that there were so many prophecies of Jerusalem's destruction. And then you need to think about the religious implications for this. Here are some of the most hardcore, fanatical religious Jews staying in Jerusalem to the bitter end. And here goes all these Christian Jews of this new sect, skinning out. How do you think the Orthodox Jews felt about all these Christians making a run for it in their eyes? Do you know that that was one of the first things that caused the greatest schism between those two? And they already didn't agree because, of course, the Orthodox Jews could not accept Jesus. But they still were allowing there to be dialogue back and forth. You realize some of those men were still going into those synagogues? Paul was going into synagogues long after they'd been preaching Jesus. But this began to create a terrible prejudice between the Orthodox Jews, I don't mean that in the modern sense of the word, but the Jews who were the conservative, and the Christian Jews. Because they saw the Christian Jews as traitors. They're leaving us, we need them here, they shouldn't be deserting the city. And it caused a terrible, bitter feeling, which ended up later after the destruction of Jerusalem. We'll talk about this in another class. The Jews decided in a council of their rabbis to forbid any Jew who believes in Christianity to even enter a synagogue. So you can see how the Jews and the Christians started to really split and splinter at the end of the first century. Another reason why the church was affected the way it was. Another reason why by the time you get to the second century, the church is in some areas vehemently anti-Semitic. Well, there were reasons why some of that was created. James, the leader of that church, was killed just a handful of years prior to all this going on, just a couple of years. So that would have caused a terrible shockwave in that church. And then for all this to be going on, they were reminding themselves some of the statements Jesus made. I'm going to read just a couple of them here. Matthew 24, the first few verses, Jesus went out and departed from the temple. His disciples came to him, and they wanted to show him the buildings of the temple. And here's his response. Jesus said unto them, See you not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. I heard somebody make the argument that that prophecy hasn't come to pass yet. There's still stones that haven't fallen because look at the Wailing Wall. That's not the temple. There is nothing left of the temple. There's not one stone there of that temple left. The Western Wall is the Western Wall, again, of Herod's enclosure, that big agora that went around the Temple Mount. Then Luke 19:41-44, when he was come near, he beheld the city, and he wept over it, saying, If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace. But now they are hid from thine eyes, for the days shall come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee around, and keep thee in on every side, and shall lay thee even with the ground, and thy children within thee, and they shall not leave in thee one stone upon another. And here's why. Because thou knewest not the day of thy visitation. You didn't understand your Messiah was here, you wouldn't accept him, and thus God's bringing this judgment on you. Some people apply that out to Armageddon. Some people apply that to 70 AD, and some people make it a dual prophecy. And in some of these places, you might be safest making it a dual prophecy. And that is that elements of it did occur in 70 AD, and elements of it are going to occur in the great, terrible tribulation to come. And then 2 chapters later, Luke 21:20-24, is when he warns about when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Notice that word desolation. That is a key word to some other prophecies. When you see the city compassed with armies, know the desolation is nigh, it's near. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it, Jerusalem, depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. So some took that probably to be applying to 70 AD, and it could apply to both that and Armageddon. And then 2 more scriptures. Luke 23:26-31. Jesus is on his way to the cross. People are weeping and crying. And he says, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in the which they shall say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bare, and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills cover us. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry? And then finally Daniel 9. I'm not going to read through all this, but this is the prophecy of the 70 weeks of Daniel. At the very end he said, After 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. I believe that's a prophecy of Titus, Vespasian's son, who would later destroy the city and the sanctuary, the people of the prince that shall come. And the end thereof shall be with a flood. That word flood in Hebrew doesn't necessarily have to necessitate water. It's a great, terrible influx of something. And it certainly was a flood of the armies that came into Jerusalem. So there's some of the reasons why the church at Jerusalem, the Christian church, might have been leaving. Some say they went to Pella, some to other places where they hid during this time. After 70 AD, you don't really see a Christian church in Jerusalem anymore. So most historians would agree they left during that period. Okay, 67 AD, spring. The Jews have begun seizing fortresses. They've got Masada. They've got fortresses throughout the countryside. They're fortifying cities. They're setting up military governors over these 7 territories. What is this going to sound like back in Rome? They're really moving quickly to consolidate power over what they've taken. And now we've got to do something about it. So one of the brightest and best generals, in his late 50s at this particular point in his life, Vespasian, was tasked by Emperor Nero to go to Judea and crush this rebellion. His son Titus went with him, and 60,000 troops as well, which is twice what Gallus had. So they were sent to subdue Israel in the spring of 67 AD. The first major conflict was at Jotapata. Jotapata is where Josephus had entrenched himself. He was under siege by Vespasian. By July of 67 AD, Jotapata fell. He laid siege to it for 7 weeks. According to Josephus' own words, he and 40 of his men fled and hid in a cave. He was debating whether or not they should just surrender to the Romans. And according to Josephus, the other men said, we are never going to surrender to the Romans. Let's all take each other's lives. Finally, they argued, according to Josephus, all this is according to Josephus, finally they argued him into joining them, and they all started to kill each other, until finally there were just 2 left. Now this will tell you a whole lot about Josephus. As soon as it got down to Josephus and one man, Josephus said, let's not do this. Let's go ahead and surrender. So after their companions had killed themselves, and he said he's all for it, he's going to go along with it, Josephus decided, I don't want to do that after all. So they did surrender to the Romans. Changed his mind, I guess. Talk about a savvy thing to do. This is the statement that he made to Vespasian when he was brought before him. He said that you have not captured a general today, but a prophet. And here's my prophecy. No longer do I call you Vespasian, but I call you Caesar, because you and your son will both become emperors. Now maybe it was a prophecy, because there's no way he could have known that, and he and his son both did become emperors. Vespasian did not come up in the aristocratic families of Rome. Vespasian was a self-made man. He started from a low-class family and built himself up in the military ranks until he was one of the most powerful generals in Rome. And now here's a man that had no right by birth to even be a part of the elite society, and he did have the ability in his hands that he could have become emperor one day. So I'm sure he had a little bit of an ego, and it didn't help matters any that here's this Jewish man telling you, here's the prophecy, you're going to become the emperor and so's your son. He wasn't an emperor at all at this point. So they took Josephus prisoner and held him prisoner for some time. The end of Josephus' story is that he ended up traveling along and recording all the events of the war. He saw them by traveling with the Romans, not by being on the Jewish side, but by being with the Romans. And after the war was over and he was freed from imprisonment, they made him a retainer of their household. And he took the name Titus Flavius Josephus. So he was a turncoat in a lot of the Jews' eyes. Their view of Josephus was he's a turncoat, he's a traitor, so he wasn't exactly favorable among the rest of the Jews. But he is very famous as a Jewish historian of the first century because he did write quite a bit about the Jews' religion as well as about what happened during this time. 67 AD, July to November. Vespasian is moving throughout Israel, reestablishing Roman control in the north and elsewhere. He purposely did not go straight for Jerusalem. He wanted to take complete control of all the countryside so they had nowhere to escape to and they had no supply lines. So once he took control of the countryside, then he was going to come in on Jerusalem. John of Giscala, one of the principal rebel leaders in the north, he was defeated by Vespasian in between July and November of 67. He was surrounded by troops at Giscala, and he appealed to Titus, who was there at the time, not to enter the city and invade it yet. He knew the city was about to fall, but he said, at least give us one more day before you attack us, because it's a Sabbath day. Since it's a Sabbath day, just don't attack us today. Give us one more night for the Sabbath. In the middle of the night, while Titus was politely waiting for the Sabbath to end, John of Giscala made a run for it, and he escaped to Jerusalem. And John of Giscala was determined to be the principal man in Jerusalem, to eventually take over the city. So that's part of what's underneath the surface for him. 68 AD, the Zealots, remember I told you, had been in control of the temple. They'd been using it as their fortress. In the middle of this particular period of time, and they might have had good reason for this, they declared that the Jewish priesthood up to that point in time, Ananias and the rest of them, were all corrupt. They're going to have to be immediately replaced. And they said, we're going to cast lots to choose a new high priest. Now, do you think Ananias and the rest just took that peaceably? You think it made them mad? Well, they weren't able to do anything about it because the Zealots had the temple. They cast lots and chose a guy who didn't even have any education from the countryside to be the high priest. That really set off the aristocratic Sadducees. So they decided they're going to rile up all the common people and take over the temple again. Kill the Zealots, get them out of the temple. Mind you, they're in the middle of fighting a war with Rome. Yes, Cindy, they went on through the whole time. They were constantly fighting among themselves. So Ananias and a number of the most powerful and prominent citizens attempted to encourage the people to attack the Zealots and remove them from the temple. The Zealots had a preemptive strike, though. They heard about it, so they attacked them first. The Zealots came breaking out of the temple, and here's this big crowd of Jewish people approaching the temple to attack the temple and get the Zealots out. And they all started throwing rocks at each other to start with. When the rocks didn't do enough damage, they started throwing javelins. And finally, they broke out their swords and started hacking each other. And they got the better of the Zealots, and the Zealots had to retreat back to the temple. So the Zealots are barricaded into the temple. In the meantime, you've got John of Giscala, who had been trying to worm his way into a relationship with Ananias the high priest. Ananias didn't really trust him, and most of the elite in the city didn't really trust him either. But he told him, I'll pledge a covenant, so to speak, with you, that I'm on your side, and I will be the one to go in and parley with the zealots, and we'll bring them out. Well, John of Giscala went in there. As soon as he walked in, the door shut. He told the zealots, I'm on your side. This is John of Giscala. He said, I'm on your side, and here's your choices. You can surrender, and they'll kill you. So why would you want to do that? Or you can get some messengers to break out of here and go summon some help from outside the city to rescue you. So a couple of messengers were able to break through the lines and head out and get help from the Idumeans. You know who the Idumeans are? They're the Edomites. That's where Herod's family originally came from. The Idumeans did not want Titus and Vespasian to take the city back, and what they were told by the messengers was, this was a lie by the way, Ananias has got a secret deal with Vespasian that when Vespasian gets here, he's opening up the gates. 20,000 Idumeans showed up to rescue the zealots. Now they couldn't get into the city because the aristocrats barricaded the gates and had troops on the walls. So in the middle of the night there was a terrible storm, tremendously loud thunderclaps. And while all this thunder and lightning is going on, a group of zealots snuck out of the temple with saws and sawed through the city gates and let the Idumeans in. And the Idumeans came in like a flood, murdering anybody to get through to the zealots, and again caused a bloodbath. Now mind you, this is all kindred killing each other when they're already at war with Rome. They killed Ananias, and they killed most of his followers, and from that point on, there really wasn't any moderate party left in Jerusalem. It was really all zealots and extremists who were never going to bow to Rome. So that ended that.
Civil War.
There was a civil war going on in the middle of a war with outside forces. Josephus took that so seriously that in his writings he dated the downfall of the Jewish state to the day that they murdered Ananias the high priest. He really looked up to Ananias the high priest. And he made this statement, and this is incredible what words he used if you really think about this. He said the Jewish state ended in February of 68 AD, which is when they murdered Ananias the high priest, when the Jews beheld their high priest, listen to this title, the captain of their salvation, butchered in the heart of Jerusalem. That's what Josephus called Ananias the high priest. And I thought to myself when I first read that, if they had really understood who the captain of their salvation was, he had been killed 30-some years before this. And much of this could have been stopped if that hadn't happened. But here he is. That's when the Jewish state ended, when they butchered Ananias the high priest, the captain of their salvation. No, the Jewish state truly ended when they butchered their high priest, Jesus Christ.
The city was surrounded by Roman troops, right?
Not yet.
Oh, it was.
Not yet. Right now, Vespasian's taking those 60,000 troops and taking control of all the land around Jerusalem.
We got in there.
No.
Okay.
Most of what Vespasian was doing at the beginning was in Galilee in the north and in the west. He was taking the main principal cities and getting control of them. Vespasian continued to take rebel fortresses throughout the spring of 68 AD. And during this time, because he's constantly taking these cities, any Jewish refugees that were against the Roman occupation were fleeing to Jerusalem. Eventually, everything is being taken over but Jerusalem. So any Jewish refugees have to flee to Jerusalem. Now, what does that do to Jerusalem? Well, these were not only having civil war between them, they were burning the grain of other people in the city just to starve them out. So they were destroying themselves. And now you got thousands upon thousands of people just packing into the city that all need food, places to stay. It aggravated the problem to a great extent. It was somewhere during this time in the spring of 68 AD, and I don't know if y'all realize this, where the Dead Sea Scrolls probably originated, or a community of Essenes at Qumran. Sometime in the spring, summertime of 68 AD, Vespasian massacred the Essenes at Qumran. Maybe he felt like they were a threat to him. Maybe they were preaching, because they were some preachers. They were always preaching apocalyptic things. Maybe he thought they were going to preach people into a war state with him. I don't know. But he ended up murdering the community at Qumran. And then June of 68 AD, several really critical things happened. We talked about the Roman emperors. That's why I wanted to lead you all the way up to the end of the first century with them when we talked about our church history some time back. Emperor Nero commits suicide. When he does, everything breaks into civil war in Rome. They're trying to decide who the next emperor is going to be. Galba accedes to emperor. Then by January 69, Galba's assassinated. Then Otho accedes to emperor, and he eventually kills himself in April of 69, or was murdered, depending on your perspective. And then Vitellius. It's what the Romans call, we talked about before, the year of the four emperors. Vitellius then takes control. Now here's the problem for this as far as Vespasian is concerned. If the Roman emperor dies, a Roman military command that he gave is on pause. Because maybe the next emperor doesn't want you to do that. So Vespasian, when Nero committed suicide, Nero is the one that tasked him to go to Israel. He had to sit still. Thus, the Jews had months to cause all their havoc among themselves, while Vespasian was sitting still, waiting for word from Rome on what to do. During this period of time, Simon Bar Giora leaves Masada, and he starts to gather a large following of people. So he's outside the walls of Jerusalem in 69 AD. Right after the Zealot temple siege, John of Giscala set himself up as the ruler in Jerusalem. The Jews in Jerusalem did not like John of Giscala being their ruler. He was becoming a real despotic ruler. A lot of violence was going on in the streets. They asked Simon Bar Giora if they opened the gates to him, would he come in and straighten John of Giscala out? So now we've got two of them in the city. We've got Simon Bar Giora, we've got John of Giscala, and then we've got what's left of the Zealots who have still got a hold of the temple compound, who are under the Eleazar. So you got these three leaders. They're all fighting among themselves. They all have a section of the city that they have control of, and they're all fighting among themselves. So Simon Bar Giora, John of Giscala, and the Zealot leader is Eleazar ben Simon. 69 AD, June. Vespasian still hasn't received word. It's been a year that he's been sitting there without receiving any word from Rome on what he should do, so he just starts to resume military action. That's pretty bold. Nobody gave him a command. He just heads back to resume military action. And then finally in July of 69 AD, Vespasian was proclaimed emperor by the legions in the east. This is usually how it happened, by the way. In this period of the Roman Empire, quite often for someone to become an emperor, if you get the troops behind you, you get enough of the troops, who's going to stop you? The legions in the east declare that Vespasian is emperor, and he transfers the command of the Jewish-Roman war to his son Titus and starts heading back to Rome. And in December of 69 AD, Emperor Vitellius is killed, probably by some of Vespasian's men, and Vespasian is officially installed as the emperor. And the prophecy that Josephus had claimed was his comes to pass. Finally, Titus begins to plan the siege of Jerusalem, which is what the next time we have a church history class we'll talk about. I'll give you two scriptures to close that out. Luke 21:24. Titus is getting ready to besiege Jerusalem. It's going to change the course of history, and it'll begin the process which will culminate in the Jews being exiled from their homeland for almost 1,800 plus years. Luke 21:24 says, "They shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." That tells you right there that that prophecy is talking about 70 AD, because we're in the times of the Gentiles right now. You could argue the Jews claim Jerusalem, and I think they're right for claiming it. And Jews in Israel claim Jerusalem as their capital city, you know. Now, nobody will recognize that really but them. The nations of this world as a whole will not accept that. And even today, even though they claim that as their capital, it's still being trodden down under the feet of the Gentiles. And the times of the Gentiles have not been fulfilled. And then finally, Romans 11:25-26 gives you the hope, because this is part of Jewish history. It's pretty dark. Romans 11:25-26. "For I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob." That was written after the death and resurrection of Jesus by Paul the Apostle. I think he was hearkening right back to what Jesus had said in Luke 21, that they have to be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Because Paul's statement was, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. So Jesus was alluding to the fact that Jerusalem was going to fall, and the Jews were going to go through a terrible desolation, cut off from God, and cut off from their homeland, until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled, Paul said. And then all Israel shall be saved. And I suppose that's as positive a note as I can try to end it on tonight when it's such a dark history lesson we're having. The next time we have a church history class, we'll talk about the siege of Jerusalem and the end of the war, and we'll be done with the war. Some of this is background for why the church ended up where it did.